My son-in-law threw a glass at my face when I refused to pour him more wine. He laughed. My house now, learn to obey. The next morning, I changed the locks and made something that made him scream. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my own dining room would become a battlefield. At 68 years old, I believed I had earned the right to eat dinner in peace, especially in the house I had called home for 37 years. But that Thursday evening, as autumn rain drummed against the windows, my son-in-law Ronald shattered more than just a wine glass. The dinner had started normally enough. My daughter Sarah had invited me over, claiming she wanted to spend quality time with her old man. I should have known something was off when she kept glancing nervously at Ronald, who sat at the head of my old oak table like he owned the place, which, according to the paperwork I had signed 2 years ago, he technically did. "Dad, could you pour Ronald some more wine?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying that careful tone I had grown to despise. It was the voice she used when she was walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace in her own home. I looked at Ronald, already on his third glass, his face flushed and his eyes holding that familiar glint of entitlement. Something in me rebelled. Maybe it was the way he had spent the entire meal talking over me, dismissing my stories about the old neighborhood with waves of his hand. Maybe it was how he had criticized the pot roast I had brought, saying Sarah's cooking was finally improving now that she didn't have to accommodate old-fashioned tastes. "You know where the bottle is," I said quietly, cutting into my meat. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and I could feel her panic radiating across the table. Ronald's chair creaked as he leaned back, studying me with the kind of cold calculation that made my skin crawl. "Excuse me?" His voice was dangerously soft. I met his gaze steadily. "I said you know where the bottle is. Your legs work fine." The transformation in Ronald's face was immediate and terrifying. The mask of civilized behavior slipped completely, revealing something ugly underneath. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor, and before I could react, he had grabbed his wine glass and hurled it directly at my face. The crystal shattered against my forehead, sending shards cascading onto my dinner plate and wine soaking into my shirt. The impact left a sharp cut above my left eyebrow, and I felt warm blood trickling down my cheek. For a moment, the dining room was completely silent except for the steady drip of wine falling from the table edge onto the carpet my late wife had chosen 20 years ago. "My house now, old man," Ronald said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Time you learned to obey." I sat there, blood running down my face, staring at this man who had married my daughter and slowly poisoned her against me. Sarah hadn't moved, hadn't protested, hadn't even reached for a napkin to help clean the blood from my face. She just sat there, frozen, staring at her plate like it held the answers to all of life's problems. That's when I knew I had lost her completely. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "are you going to say anything?" She looked up then, her eyes swimming with tears, but when she opened her mouth, no words came. Ronald laughed, actually laughed, as he watched his wife struggle to choose between her husband and her father. "She knows who pays the bills around here," he said, settling back into his chair like nothing had happened. "Don't you, sweetheart?" The ride home was a blur of streetlights and rain-slicked roads. I drove carefully, despite the blood still seeping from the cut on my forehead and the humiliation burning in my chest like acid. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house that was no longer legally mine. But Ronald had made one crucial mistake that night. In his arrogance, in his need to humiliate me completely, he had shown me exactly who he really was, and more importantly, he had reminded me who I used to be. The next morning, I called a locksmith. "I need every lock in this house changed," I told him when he arrived at 7 sharp. "Every single one." As the locksmith worked, I stood in my kitchen sipping coffee from the mug Sarah had given me for Father's Day 5 years ago, before Ronald had sunk his claws into her completely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was changing the locks on a house that wasn't technically mine anymore. But Ronald didn't know everything about the papers he thought gave him control. He had been so eager to get his hands on what he saw as his prize that he hadn't read the fine print carefully. Neither had Sarah, for that matter. They had both been so focused on the immediate gratification of ownership that they had missed the most important details. The locksmith finished just as my phone started ringing. Ronald's name flashed on the screen, and I could imagine his fury when he discovered he couldn't get into his house. I let it ring until it stopped, then immediately started ringing again. Let him rage, let him pound on the door and demand entry. Because what Ronald didn't understand, what he was about to learn the hard way, was that at 68 years old, I hadn't survived this long by being anyone's doormat. And the real surprise? The papers he thought gave him everything actually gave him nothing at all. The pounding on my front door started at 8:30 that morning, barely an hour after the locksmith had left. I was sitting in my recliner, the same spot where I had spent countless evenings with my late wife Margaret, reading the newspaper and pretending I couldn't hear Ronald's increasingly frantic attempts to get inside. "Arthur, open this door right now." His voice voice carried through the thick oak, muffled but unmistakably furious. "This is my house. You can't lock me out of my own property." I turned the page of my newspaper calmly, though my hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally taking action after 2 years of swallowing my pride and watching my daughter disappear into Ronald's web of control. The truth was, I had been planning this moment since the day Ronald first suggested I transfer the house to Sarah for tax purposes. He had presented it so smoothly, with charts and graphs about estate planning, making it sound like he was doing me a favor. Sarah had been so grateful, so relieved that her husband was taking care of everything. But I hadn't gotten to be 68 years old without learning a thing or two about men like Ronald. The pounding intensified, and I heard him shouting for Sarah. My heart clenched when I heard my daughter's voice, high and anxious, trying to calm him down. Through the window I could see them on my front porch, Ronald's face red with rage while Sarah clutched his arm, begging him to just talk to Dad reasonably. What Sarah didn't know, what Ronald definitely didn't know, was that the house transfer 2 years ago had been a carefully orchestrated performance on my part. Yes, I had signed papers. Yes, I had gone through the motions of transferring ownership, but the documents Ronald thought gave him control were as worthless as his promises to take care of my daughter. I remembered that day so clearly. Ronald had scheduled the meeting with his lawyer, a slick young man in an expensive suit who spoke in legal jargon designed to confuse. Margaret had been gone for 3 years by then, and Sarah was so worried about my financial security that she practically begged me to go along with Ronald's plan. "It's just smart planning, Dad," she had said, her eyes shining with the kind of trust that breaks a father's heart. "Ronald knows about these things. He just wants to protect our family." But I had spent 42 years working in insurance investigation before I retired. I knew exactly how to spot a con, and Ronald's entire presentation had been textbook manipulation. The urgency, the complex explanations, the way he kept emphasizing how much money I would save in taxes, it was all designed to pressure me into signing without asking too many questions. So I had played along. I had signed the papers with a shaky hand, putting on the performance of a confused old man who didn't really understand what was happening. Ronald had been so pleased with himself, so confident that he had outsmarted the old fool, that he never bothered to verify the authenticity of the documents because the papers he had me sign were fake. The real transfer documents were sitting in my safety deposit box, unsigned and worthless. The lawyer Ronald had brought wasn't actually a lawyer at all, just an actor I had hired through a friend in the theater community. The entire meeting had been an elaborate setup designed to make Ronald believe he had won, while giving me time to plan my real strategy. The pounding on the door stopped suddenly, and I heard muffled voices as Ronald and Sarah argued on my porch. Through the curtain, I could see him pacing back and forth, his hands gesturing wildly while Sarah tried to reason with him. The sight of my daughter, still trying to protect a man who had thrown a glass at her father's face, made my chest tight with grief. 28 years old and still believing that love meant accepting unacceptable behavior. I had failed her somehow, failed to teach her that she deserved better than a man who would humiliate her father in their own dining room. My phone rang again, and this time it was Sarah calling. I considered not answering, but the father in me couldn't ignore my daughter's call even now. "Dad, please." Her voice was thick with tears. "Ronald is really upset. He says you're being unreasonable. Can't you just open the door so we can talk about this?" "Sarah," I said carefully, "did your husband tell you what happened at dinner last night?" Silence. Then, in a smaller voice, "He said you were disrespectful to him, that you embarrassed him in front of me." My hand tightened on the phone. Of course he had twisted it, made himself the victim. "And what did he tell you about the wine glass?" Another pause. "He said it was an accident, that he was gesturing and it slipped." An accident. The man had looked me directly in the eye and hurled crystal at my face, and he was calling it an accident. The cut above my eyebrow, still tender under its bandage, throbbed with the memory. "Sarah, honey," I said, forcing my voice to stay gentle, "I need you to think very carefully about what you saw last night. Really think about it. Dad, please. Ronald is my husband. I have to support him. Can't you just apologize and we can all move forward?" And there it was. After everything, she still believed that I was the problem, that I was the one who needed to apologize. Ronald's conditioning had been more thorough than I had realized. "I'll tell you what, sweetheart," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Why don't you and Ronald go home and think about things for a while? Give us all some time to cool down." I could hear Ronald shouting something in the background, but Sarah's voice was small when she answered. "Okay, Dad, but we need to figure this out soon, Ronald says. Ronald says if you don't start being more cooperative, things are going to get complicated." The threat was clear, even wrapped in Sarah's gentle delivery. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my house, the house that Ronald thought he owned, and smiled for the first time in months. Let things get complicated. I had been preparing for complicated for 2 years, and Ronald had no idea what was coming. 3 days passed before Ronald made his next move, and when he did, it was exactly what I had been waiting for. The certified letter arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by a postal worker who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope marked Urgent Legal Notice. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into my kitchen chair, taking my time opening the envelope while the morning sun streamed through the window Margaret had always loved. Inside was a formal eviction notice demanding that I vacate the premises within 7 days or face legal action for trespassing. The letter was signed by a real lawyer this time. Someone Ronald had clearly paid good money to craft this intimidation tactic. Reading through the legal jargon, I could almost hear Ronald's smug satisfaction as he dictated the terms. He probably thought this would send me scrambling to pack my belongings and find some tiny apartment where I could live out my remaining years in defeat. Poor Ronald. He still had so much to learn. I reached for my phone and called the number I had been saving for exactly this moment. Peterson, Morrison and Associates, the receptionist answered professionally. This is Arthur Caldwell. I need to speak with James Peterson immediately. James Peterson had been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since Margaret's cancer diagnosis had forced us to get our affairs in order. He was the only person besides myself who knew the complete truth about the house transfer documents, and he had been waiting patiently for this call. Arthur, James's familiar voice came on the line within minutes. I take it our friend has finally shown his hand? Eviction notice, I said, scanning the letter again. 7 days to vacate the premises. James chuckled, a sound that held no humor but plenty of anticipation. Perfect. Are you ready to proceed with phase 2? More than ready. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in James's office watching him review the eviction notice with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from knowing you're about to destroy someone's carefully constructed lies. This is actually going to be easier than we thought, James said, leaning back in his leather chair. By filing this eviction notice, Ronald has essentially committed fraud in writing. He's claiming legal ownership of property that he has never actually owned. The real documents came out of James's safe like evidence in a murder trial. The authentic house transfer papers, the ones that would have actually changed ownership, sat unsigned in their manila folder. Below them were copies of the fake documents Ronald thought were real, complete with the forged lawyer's signature and the fabricated legal stamps. The beauty of this, James explained, spreading the papers across his mahogany desk, is that Ronald has now created a paper trail of his attempted theft. Every time he's claimed ownership, every time he's threatened you based on that ownership, he's been committing fraud. I stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because my plan was working perfectly. Sadness because it had come to this. Because my own daughter had been so thoroughly manipulated that she couldn't see what her husband really was. There's something else, James said, his expression growing more serious. I've been doing some digging into Ronald's background like you asked. What I found is concerning. He slid another folder across the desk, this one considerably thicker. Inside were bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like documentation from several gambling websites. Your son-in-law has a serious problem, James continued. He owes approximately $87,000 to various creditors, most of it gambling debt. The house that he thinks he owns, he's already tried to use it as collateral for a loan that was denied when the bank couldn't verify his ownership. My blood ran cold. $87,000. No wonder Ronald had been so desperate to get his hands on my house. No wonder he had been pushing so hard for the transfer, putting on that elaborate show about tax benefits and family protection. It gets worse, James said quietly. According to my sources, some of this debt is to people who don't take kindly to late payments, the kind of people who might show up at someone's house looking for compensation. The full picture was finally coming into focus, and it was uglier than I had imagined. Ronald hadn't just been trying to steal my house out of greed or a desire for control. He had been trying to steal it out of desperation, probably planning to mortgage it or sell it to pay off his gambling debts. And Sarah had no idea. What do you want to do? James asked. I thought about my daughter, still believing she was married to a man who cared about her welfare. I thought about Ronald, probably celebrating what he believed was his victory over the stubborn old man who had finally been put in his place. I thought about Margaret and what she would have wanted me to do. I want you to schedule a meeting, I said finally. Ronald, Sarah, and his fake lawyer if he wants to bring him. Tell them we're going to discuss the terms of my departure from the house. James raised an eyebrow. And then we're going to show Ronald exactly what happens when you try to con a man who spent 4 decades investigating insurance fraud. The meeting was was set for Thursday afternoon at James's office. I spent the intervening days preparing, going through old photo albums and letters, remembering the daughter Sarah used to be before Ronald's influence began poisoning her mind. I found pictures of her college graduation, her wedding day, family Christmases when she still looked at me with genuine affection instead of nervous obligation. Somewhere along the way, I had lost her to a man who saw her as nothing more than a pathway to financial security. But maybe, just maybe, when she saw the truth about who she had married, I could get her back. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully in my best suit, the same one I had worn to Margaret's funeral. I wanted to look respectable, dignified, like a man who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from the truth. As I drove to James's office, I thought about the moment when Ronald would realize that his house of cards was about to collapse. Part of me felt sorry for Sarah, who would have to watch her world crumble in real time. But another part of me, the part that still bore the scar from his wine glass, was looking forward to seeing Ronald's face when he learned that he had been outsmarted by the old fool he had so thoroughly underestimated. The time for games was over. Today the truth would finally come out, and Ronald would discover that stealing from Arthur Caldwell was the biggest mistake he had ever made. The moment Ronald walked into James Peterson's office, I could see the confidence radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He had dressed for victory in his most expensive suit, the one Sarah had probably bought him for their anniversary, and he carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he was about to watch his father-in-law grovel for mercy. Sarah followed behind him, her face pale and drawn, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. She had been crying, I could tell, probably for hours. The guilt of choosing her husband over her father was eating her alive, but she was still here, still standing by Ronald's side. "Arthur," Ronald said, his voice dripping with false courtesy as he settled into the leather chair across from me. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses. This whole situation has been very stressful for Sarah." He reached over and squeezed my daughter's hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to demonstrate his caring nature. Sarah managed a weak smile, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of trying to hold together a marriage that was slowly destroying her. "I want to make this as easy as possible for everyone," Ronald continued, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. "I've prepared a reasonable timeline for your move, and I've even found some nice senior living communities that might suit your needs. Nothing too expensive, of course, but adequate." The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench, but I kept my expression neutral. James sat beside me, perfectly calm, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. To anyone watching, it probably looked like we were preparing to surrender. "Before we discuss any timelines," James said smoothly, "I think we should clarify a few legal matters. Mr. Brennan, I understand you're claiming ownership of Arthur's house based on transfer documents signed 2 years ago?" "That's correct," Ronald said, his chest puffing out with pride. "Arthur signed the house over to Sarah, and as her husband, I have full legal authority to make decisions about the property." "I see." James opened his own folder, much thicker than Ronald's. "And you have the original documents to support this claim?" Ronald's lawyer, the same slick young man from 2 years ago, leaned forward. "Of course we do. The transfer was properly executed and witnessed. Mr. Caldwell's claims to the contrary are simply the confused ramblings of an elderly man who's having trouble accepting reality." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Sarah flinched, glancing between her husband and her father with growing anxiety. I could see her starting to question whether this was really necessary, whether Ronald's cruelty was justified even if he was technically in the right. "Interesting," James said, pulling out a set of documents and sliding them across the polished conference table. "Because according to the county records office, no such transfer has ever been filed." The silence that followed was deafening. Ronald's face went from confident to confused to something approaching panic in the span of about 10 seconds. His lawyer grabbed the papers, scanning them frantically while his face grew progressively paler. "This has to be a mistake," Ronald said, his voice climbing an octave. "We filed everything properly. Sarah, you were there. You saw me submit the paperwork." But Sarah was staring at the county documents with a growing look of horror. "Ronald," she whispered, "what is this? What's happening?" James cleared his throat and pulled out another set of papers. "Mr. Brennan, I think you need to understand something. The documents you believe gave you ownership of Arthur's house were never legally valid. The lawyer who oversaw the signing wasn't actually a lawyer at all." Ronald's fake lawyer was reading through the county records with shaking hands. "Mr. Brennan," he said carefully, "I think we need to discuss this privately before we proceed further." "No," Ronald snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I want to know what's going on right now. Arthur, what did you do?" I leaned back in my chair, feeling calmer than I had in months. "I did exactly what any reasonable person would do when someone tries to steal their house. I protected myself." "You lying old bastard!" Ronald exploded, jumping to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward. "You can't do this, Sarah. Tell him he can't do this." But Sarah wasn't looking at Ronald anymore. She was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. For the first time in 2 years, she was seeing her father not as a confused old man to be managed, but as someone who had been playing a much deeper game than anyone had realized. "Dad," she said quietly, "you knew? This whole time you knew what Ronald was trying to do?" Before I could answer, James was pulling out more documents. "There's something else, Sarah. Something you need to know about your husband's financial situation. The gambling records came out like evidence in a murder trial. Bank statements showing massive withdrawals, credit card bills for cash advances, documentation of loans Ronald had taken out without Sarah's knowledge. The debt total sat at the top of the summary page like a death sentence, $87,436. Sarah's face went white as she read through the papers. "Ronald," she whispered, "is this true? Do you really owe almost $90,000? Ronald was backing toward the door, his eyes darting between the documents and the faces staring at him with growing understanding. "Sarah, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. I was trying to make money for us, for our future. The house was going to be our security." "Whose security?" I asked quietly. "Yours or the people you owe money to?" The question hit home. Ronald's face crumpled as he realized his carefully constructed lies were falling apart piece by piece. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "These people, they're not patient. They want their money now. The house was the only way to get it." "So you were planning to sell my father's house without telling me?" Sarah's voice was rising, 2 years of suppressed doubts finally finding their voice. "You were going to take the place where I grew up and use it to pay off your gambling debts?" "It would have been our house," Ronald shouted. "After he died, it would have been ours anyway. I was just making it happen sooner." The words hung in the air like a confession. Sarah recoiled as if she had been slapped, finally understanding that her husband had been counting on her father's death as a solution to his financial problems. James was pulling out yet another folder. "Mr. Brennan, there's one more thing you should know. Attempting to fraudulently claim ownership of someone else's property is a felony in this state. So is forging legal documents and impersonating a lawyer." Ronald's fake lawyer was already heading for the door. "I was never here," he muttered. "I don't know any of you people." As the door slammed behind him, Ronald stood alone in the center of the room, his world collapsing around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. Sarah was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body as she finally understood the depth of her husband's betrayal. And I sat there watching the man who had thrown a wine glass at my face realize that he had just lost everything he thought he had gained. The real reckoning was just beginning. The ride home from the lawyer's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Sarah sat in my passenger seat, clutching the folder of evidence against Ronald like it might disappear if she let go. She hadn't spoken since we left James Peterson's office, hadn't even acknowledged Ronald's desperate attempts to follow us to the parking garage, shouting explanations and promises through my car window. I had watched in my rearview mirror as he stood there in his expensive suit, looking smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen him. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the wine glass shattering against my forehead, and the feeling passed. "Dad," Sarah finally whispered as we pulled into my driveway, "I need to know everything, please." Inside the house that Ronald had tried so hard to steal, I made us both coffee and sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Sarah looked so much like her mother in that moment, the same determined set to her jaw, the same way of focusing completely when she needed to understand something important. "It started the day Ronald suggested the house transfer," I began, choosing my words carefully. Something about his presentation felt wrong, too polished, too urgent. In my line of work, I learned to recognize when someone was running a con. Sarah nodded slowly, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug like she needed the warmth. "You knew from the beginning that he was lying?" "I suspected, but I needed proof before I could act. So I played along, let him think his plan was working while I gathered evidence. I told her about hiring the actor to play the fake lawyer, about the real documents sitting unsigned in James Peterson's safe, about the months of investigation that had revealed Ronald's gambling addiction and mounting debts. With each revelation, I watched my daughter's face change, watched her process the depth of her husband's deception. "The worst part," I said gently, "is that he was planning to use you as much as he was planning to use me. The house wasn't going to secure your future, Sarah. It was going to pay for his mistakes." Sarah set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "I should have seen it. All those late nights when he said he was working, all those mysterious phone calls he took in the other room. I knew something was wrong, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. He's very good at manipulation," I said. "That's how people like Ronald operate. They make their victims feel crazy for questioning what they see with their own eyes." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and I could see Sarah working through 2 years of memories, re-examining moments that had never quite made sense. The way Ronald had pushed her to cut contact with her old friends, the way he had gradually isolated her from family gatherings, always finding reasons why they couldn't attend or had to leave early, the way he had made her feel guilty for wanting to spend time with me. "The night he threw the glass at you," she said suddenly. I knew it wasn't an accident. I saw his face right before it happened, but he was so convincing afterward, so apologetic. He said he was under stress about work, that he would never hurt anyone intentionally, and you wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Her voice cracked. Because if I admitted that he had thrown a glass at my father on purpose, then I would have had to admit that I had married someone capable of violence. And if he could do that to you, what might he do to me? The question hung between us like a weight. I had wondered the same thing many times over the past few days, had worried about Sarah's safety even as I planned Ronald's downfall, but I had also known that she would never leave him based on my word alone. She had to see the truth for herself. My phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. Ronald's name flashed on the screen, and I could see Sarah tense up immediately. "Answer it," she said quietly. "I want to hear what he has to say now that we know the truth." I put the phone on speaker and answered on the 4th ring. Ronald's voice filled the kitchen, high-pitched and frantic. "Arthur, please, you have to listen to me. This is all a misunderstanding. Yes, I owe some money, but I was handling it. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "Ronald," I said calmly, "Sarah is here with me. She's heard everything." A pause. Then Ronald's voice took on the wheedling tone he used when he was trying to manipulate Sarah. "Baby, please come home. We can work this out. Your father is making this seem worse than it is. I love you, Sarah. Everything I did was for us." Sarah leaned toward the phone, her voice steadier than I had heard it in months. "Ronald, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I know about the gambling. I know about the debts. I know about the fake lawyer and the fake documents. And I know that you threw a wine glass at my father's face and then lied about it." "Sarah, please." "I'm not finished." Her voice was getting stronger with each word. "I also know that you tried to steal my father's house to pay off debts that I knew nothing about. You were planning to sell the place where I grew up, where my mother died, where some of my happiest memories were made, and you were going to do it without even telling me. It wasn't like that. I was trying to protect you from the stress." "No," Sarah interrupted, and I felt a surge of pride at the steel in her voice. "You were trying to protect yourself from your own mistakes, from your own choices, from the consequences of your own actions, and you were willing to destroy my relationship with my father to do it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I thought Ronald might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different. The charm was gone, the manipulation replaced by something cold and ugly. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Both of you. But you have no idea what you've done. The people I owe money to, they don't care about your feelings or your family drama. When they can't get their money from the house, they're going to come looking for other ways to collect." "Is that a threat, Ronald?" I asked quietly. "It's a reality check, old man. You think you've won something here, but all you've done is put your precious daughter in danger. When my creditors start showing up at her workplace, when they start following her home, remember that you could have prevented it." Sarah's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Ronald, if you're really worried about my safety, then you should have thought about that before you racked up $90,000 in gambling debt." "87,000, he corrected automatically, then seemed to realize what he had just admitted. "Sarah, baby, please, I can fix this. I just need some time." "You're right about one thing," Sarah said, looking directly at me as she spoke. "This situation is dangerous. That's why I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning." The explosion of rage from the phone was immediate and terrifying. Ronald screamed obscenities, made threats, promised revenge against both of us. I reached over and ended the call, then immediately called James Peterson to report the threats. Sarah sat quietly while I made the call, but when I hung up, she looked at me with eyes that reminded me so much of her mother that my chest tightened. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said simply, "for everything, for not seeing what he was, for not protecting you, for choosing him over you when I should have known better." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You were trying to save your marriage. There's no shame in that. There is when your marriage isn't worth saving." She squeezed my fingers. "I should have listened to my instincts. I should have trusted you." As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, we began planning Sarah's escape from a marriage that had been built on lies from the very beginning. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I had my daughter back. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen watching Sarah arrange fresh flowers in the vase that had belonged to her mother. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the small changes we had made to the house over the past few months. New curtains in the living room, fresh paint in the guest bedroom that Sarah now called home, and a security system that James Peterson had insisted we install after Ronald's threats. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Ronald hadn't contested it, probably because his lawyer had advised him that fighting Sarah's claims would only draw more attention to his attempted fraud. The last I had heard, he was living in a studio apartment across town, working 2 part-time jobs to make payments on his reduced debt load. His gambling creditors had agreed to a payment plan after James Peterson had made it clear that pursuing harassment would result in criminal charges. "The roses are beautiful this year," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her arrangement. "Mom would have loved them." I nodded, remembering how Margaret had spent hours in the garden, coaxing life from the soil with a patience that I had always admired. Sarah had inherited that same gentle persistence, though it had taken her a while to apply it to her own life. "I got a call from the bank yesterday," I said, settling into my chair with my morning coffee. "They want to offer me a reverse mortgage on the house." Sarah looked up with alarm. "Dad, you're not thinking of—" "Relax," I smiled. I told them I wasn't interested. This house isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. The relief on her face was immediate and profound. Over the past 6 months, we had both learned to value the simple security of knowing that this place, this refuge that Margaret had created, and that we had both fought to protect, would remain ours. Sarah had found a job at the local library, something that used her English degree and gave her the kind of quiet satisfaction that her marriage had never provided. She was different now, more confident, more willing to trust her own judgment. The frightened, apologetic woman who had sat frozen while her husband threw glass at her father was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more sure of herself. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "about what you said when this all started, about how Ronald showed us who he really was." "What about it?" "I think you showed me who you really were too. All those years I thought you were just my dad, you know, someone to take care of, to worry about, to make decisions for. I never realized how smart you were, how strategic, how you could plan something like this and execute it so perfectly." I chuckled, remembering the months of careful preparation, the sleepless nights when I had wondered if my plan would work or if I was just a foolish old man playing games he couldn't win. 42 years of investigating insurance fraud taught me a few things about human nature. People like Ronald always think they're the smartest person in the room. That makes them predictable. But you could have just exposed him from the beginning. You could have shown me the fake documents right away and saved us all a lot of trouble. I shook my head. "You weren't ready to hear it then. You needed to see for yourself who he really was. If I had just told you, you would have thought I was a jealous father trying to ruin your marriage." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering this. "You're right. I probably would have chosen him over you, just like I did the night he threw the glass. But you came around in the end. That's what matters." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up around us. Mrs. Henderson next door was watering her garden. The postal worker was making his rounds, whistling the same tune he had been whistling for the past 15 years. Life was normal again. Peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Ronald had first entered our lives. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen with the automatic caution that had become habit over the past few months. But instead of another threatening message from Ronald or one of his creditors, it was a message from James Peterson. "Thought you'd want to know," the text read. "Ronald was arrested last night for attempting to forge documents to get a loan. Apparently, old habits die hard." I showed the message to Sarah, who read it with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I feel sorry for him," she said quietly. "Not sorry enough to take him back or anything, but still, he's destroying his own life, and he doesn't even seem to realize it." "Some people never learn," I said. "They keep making the same mistakes over and over, always thinking that this time will be different, this time they'll get away with it. What do you think will happen to him now?" I shrugged. "That's not our problem anymore. We gave him plenty of chances to choose a different path. He chose this one." Sarah nodded, understanding. One of the hardest lessons she had learned over the past 6 months was that you couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. Ronald's problems were his own now, and neither of us was responsible for fixing them. "I have something for you," Sarah said suddenly, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped package. "It's not much, but I wanted to give you something to mark the end of all this." I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small framed photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was a picture of Margaret, Sarah, and me at Sarah's college graduation, all of us laughing at something that had happened just before the camera clicked. We looked happy, uncomplicated, like a family that genuinely enjoyed being together. "I found it in a box of things I took from the apartment when I moved out," Sarah explained. "I thought you might like to have it back." I stared at the photograph, remembering that day so clearly. Margaret had been so proud of Sarah, so excited about her future. If she could see us now, see how we had fought to protect the home she had loved and the family she had cherished, I think she would be proud of us too. "Thank you," I said. my voice rougher than I had intended. "This means more to me than you know." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I love you, Dad. I should have said that more often." "I love you too, sweetheart." As the morning light filled the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared so many quiet moments, where Sarah had eaten breakfast before school for 18 years, where we had just fought the battle for our family's survival, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. The house was ours. The family was healing. And the man who had tried to destroy both had been reduced to exactly what he deserved. Nothing more than a cautionary tale about the price of greed and the power of underestimating the people you try to hurt. At 68 years old, I had learned that it's never too late to fight for what matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, the old man wins.